In this video we'll be concerned with international trade and looking at some of the principles that underpin the rationale or the reasons why we have international trade. So the first reason we can look at is domestic non-availability. Sometimes products are not available in the domestic market, so we have to have trade. For example, tropical fruit can only be grown in the tropics. So if the people in the northern parts of the world want tropical fruit, they have to be imported. There has to be international trade in those products. But it happens in many products going in many directions. So there are sometimes very fundamental reasons why we have international trade. Non-domestic availability is one. So international trade is the exchange of goods and services between countries. That's all it is. It's the exchange of goods and services between countries. An import is the UK purchase of a good or service made overseas. So in the context of the UK imports are goods produced in other countries that are imported into the UK. They're imported and paid for in the UK. So the UK imports a lot of goods from around the world. Different types of foodstuffs, different raw materials, different products, different finished products. For example, finished cars coming in from Japan, let's say. So those are all imports. An export is the sale of a UK good or service overseas. An export in the context of the UK is when the UK sells a product or a service overseas. A nation trades because it lacks the raw materials, the climate, the specialist labour, capital or technology needed to manufacture a particular good. And trade allows a greater variety of goods and services. So trade enables countries to engage in the production of products that perhaps otherwise it couldn't do unless it gets the raw materials from overseas. But it could also be the case we have tropical fruit, as I mentioned earlier, or we have specialist labour. Certain parts of the world are noted for specialist products. Switzerland makes watches. The UK are very good at services, banking and insurance and underwriting. So different parts of the world have specialist labour, and all of this leads to trade, people dealing with each other across national boundaries. Now the principle of comparative advantage underpins a lot of international trade. It's a very fundamental piece of reasoning. Associated with a very famous economist back in the 1700s, David Ricardo. But we're not going we're not going to get involved in the technicalities of it here. We're just going to give a feeling for what the principle of comparative advantage is. This principle states that countries will benefit by concentrating on the production of those goods in which they have a relative advantage. So countries should produce the goods in which they have a relative advantage over everyone else. So they have a relative advantage, they should specialize. That's what the principle states. For instance, let's say France has the climate and the expertise to produce better wine than Brazil. So we think of wine coming from France. France is a wine producing country. Brazil is not noted for wine growing. However, Brazil is better able to produce coffee or coffee beans than France. So each country benefits by specializing in the good it is most suitable in making. So in this case, Brazil produces coffee beans and France produces wine. Now if they specialize, so France does not attempt to grow coffee beans and Brazil does not attempt to make wine. If they specialize, the resources that would have gone to try and make the other product, to make the second product in each country, those resources can all be dedicated to producing the item at which they are best suited. So all the resources in France could go to make wine, all the resources in Brazil in this case could go to make coffee or grow coffee. France then creates a surplus of wine which you can trade for the surplus Brazilian coffee. And that's how the trade takes place. France has generated a surplus of wine. It sells the surplus to, say, Brazil in exchange for the coffee beans. But Brazil itself will have a surplus of coffee beans because it's no longer attempting to make wine. So both countries benefit, and in total output will be much greater than had they both tried to make the two products. If France had tried to make wine and grow coffee beans, and if Brazil had tried to make wine and grow coffee beans. So it's better they specialize. There are objections, sorry, not objections, there are issues involved in international trade, obstacles, I think that's the word, obstacles involved in international trade. And the key one here is called protectionism. Sometimes countries want to protect markets or protect their country against imports because they're worried about unemployment or they're worried about particular sectors not developing. Let's have a look at what we mean here by protectionism. First of all, let's look at the so-called advantages of protectionism. It occurs when one country reduces the level of its imports because of, reduces the level of its imports because of so-called infant industries. Now, infant industries, sometimes sunshine firms, sometimes sunrise firms, they have various names in the literature. These firms producing, say, new technology goods, for example, computers, if they are going to survive, they need to be established and to be given some help at the early stages. They're infant industries. They're just start-up industries. They're not capable of engaging in international trade, and companies overseas who may be established for a longer period will beat them, and they may go out of existence. So in order for companies to become established, they need protection. That's the argument. Oddly enough, the argument against this one is that sometimes these companies get used to the fact that they're getting protection and they don't grow up. Unfair competition is another reason for protectionism. Foreign firms may receive subsidies or other government benefits. They may be dumping, selling goods abroad at below cost price to capture a market. So we have two concepts here. One is foreign firms may receive subsidies. Now, for example, American farmers are not subsidized, but European farmers are through the Common Agricultural Policy. So European farmers receive a subsidies, the American farmers don't. Therefore, the American farmers complain about unfair competition with Europe because they don't receive support from the government. It's unfair competition. There may be dumping. Now, dumping is when countries support companies to produce items, and the support is so great that they're able to sell the product at below cost price because the subsidy compensates them. Balance of payments. Well, to reduce imports and improve the balance of trade, sometimes countries simply block off imports in order to try and help the balance of payments. Of course, by blocking off imports, they're blocking off the satisfaction that customers got in receiving those goods. But it just, sometimes governments block off or to ban certain imports to try and support their balance of payments. Also, there's the case of strategic industries. Sometimes governments try to protect the manufacture of essential goods. They specify what essential goods are. It could be electricity generating plants, or it could be particular engineering products, or perhaps even some parts of the agricultural sector or fisheries or whatever. So the government may decide that it will not allow trade in those items. It will not allow imports in those items to try and help domestic producers. It's also the case that there could be declining industries, and in order to help a declining industry and to avoid creating further structural unemployment due to traditional industries closing down, the government may prohibit imports in those items, so that the declining industries have a new lease of life. They're able to continue in production. It may not be the most efficient way of doing things, but these are some of the reasons why protectionism is sometimes advocated. The disadvantages of protectionism, well, prevents countries from enjoying the full benefits of international specialization and trade. As consumers, we want good products, we want wide choice, and we want them at good prices. And more competition from overseas can help to bring that about. Reducing competition can start to lead to localized monopolies, higher prices, poorer quality, and so on. So there are disadvantages associated with protectionism. Of course, protectionism is also two ways. If a country does impose restrictions on imports from another country, the other country may retaliate and stop the exports from the first one. In total, international trade may contract. Countries become more self-reliant. But as a consequence, the benefits from international trade are lost. The benefits from international trade being wider choice, more competition, reduced price. The customer benefits from international trade. So a reduction in international trade is not a good thing. Protectionism also protects inefficient home industries from foreign competition, and customers pay more for inferior products. So inefficient producers may try to persuade the government to block certain imports so as to protect their businesses. What they're really doing is protecting inefficient businesses, businesses that are not capable of becoming efficient, perhaps because of bad management, poor location, poor history of investment, for various reasons. So for that reason alone, protectionism is bad. Now, the methods of protectionism, well, tariffs are used. That's an import duty. There's a surcharges on the price of imports. So we take the price of imports and the government adds on, if you like, an additional tax, the tariff. So that's one way of doing it. It increases the price of the imports, and therefore fewer imports are demanded. It raises the price of the import, as I said, so fewer will be demanded. It also, of course, reduces the demand for imports, which means that domestic producers will be able to sell more, which may be a good thing because of stability in employment, and perhaps the company has learned from its experiences and will invest more, and eventually the tariff can be reduced or eliminated. But care must be taken that the tariff is not long-term and just simply bolstering up a company that is inefficient. The tariff should encourage demand for home-produced substitutes. So it should cause customers to switch between foreign goods and domestic goods. They should switch over to domestic goods because the foreign goods are now more expensive. The tariff has made them more expensive. If the public buy the imports, of course it raises revenue for the government. The government receives the tariff. So each item imported pays a tax and the government receives the tax, which goes into the government coffers to be used in terms of budgets and can be used during the cycle of budgeting that the government goes through. Another way is quotas. Now a quota restricts the actual quantity of an import allowed into a country. It's a physical limitation. The government says that only so many of these items can be imported. After that it must stop. So it's not like a tax, it's a physical limitation. That's the number allowed, no more. It raises the price of the imports, of course, because the imports are now scarce, relatively more scarce, and therefore their price will increase. Of course, it reduces the volume of imports. The amount of imports coming in will be restricted. And it encourages demand for domestically made substitutes. Domestically made substitutes can experience an increase in demand as a consequence of a quota. When customers can't find the import, they look for whatever's available, and if that's something made domestically, they may purchase it. So those are the notes on a quota. Now there are other protection techniques. For example, administrative practices. These can discriminate against imports through customs delays or setting specifications met by domestic but not foreign producers. Sometimes countries can be awkward. They can be deliberately slow in processing imports, so the imports don't go into the country. It looks like they're allowing imports, but in fact they're being very inefficient at the port. They're taking a long time to do customs checks and deal with paperwork, and just inefficient. In fact, what they're doing is they're stopping imports. It's a protection technique. Also, exchange controls. When people import from other parts of the world, they have to pay for the imports in other currencies, and they have to exchange their currency into the other currency. The government can control the amount that's available for this purpose. The government can control the amount of foreign exchange that's available. They can reduce the amount of foreign exchange available so that people can't pay for the imports, and if they can't pay for them, imports will not happen. Now, a lot of what I've said here is more traditional economics. The world has, in a sense, moved on to some extent, and now we see greater emphasis on trading blocs throughout the world. In Europe, we have the European Union, which is a very large trading bloc, and there's the free movement of goods and people within the European Union. So what we've talked about here does not apply within the European Union. But you also get this movement with the North American Free Trade Area, which includes Canada, Mexico and America. So those three have come together. But there's also ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which includes many countries in the Far East, and so on. There are many trading blocs throughout the world, and the purpose of the trading blocs is to reduce and ultimately eliminate barriers to international trade. So it's worth bearing what I've said here in mind, but also bear in mind that these issues are becoming, in a sense, less important as people try to abolish obstacles to international trade. That's all I'm going to deal with in this session, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.